on 40. So this is our the Bible study Hickory for July 24th, 2022. And in this part of the Bible study, we're continuing our work in Genesis. And as I have pointed out many times to people, one of the major problems with our Bible study and our teachers and preachers of today is they don't know what the first verses of Genesis say. And many of us have heard, well, this Genesis 1 and 2, the first two verses were like the beginning of everything, and then you started at verse 3, and that was a restatement of everything. That was a clarification, giving more detail. That's just simply not true. When you take Genesis, that chapter 1, and you take it as it was written, without trying to impose some kind of a modern day perspective on it, to say, this is what I already believe it should be saying, so therefore I'm going to make it say what I already believe. That is the exact antithesis of God's design. The God who says, well, what did we do?
Lost it on the T. There it is.
So, okay, still there?
Yep, still there. We're good. We lost it on the TV for a moment.
Yeah, I lost it on here and here, all three of them.
Okay. Oh, wow.
That's interesting.
That is interesting.
This right here.
Yeah.
I think it's something. So, with that, let's go over here and we'll go back to where we had begun. And you take Genesis 1 and you take it as it is written, as one flowing account of what actually happened as God revealed it having happened. So we had in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And so now, this means that what God created, what he had just brought into existence, called the earth in verse 1, is the very same thing as what he says, and the earth. So in verse 2, he's going to give the condition in which the earth existed after it had been brought into existence with the heaven. And we'll see these in more of a descriptive literal translation in just a moment. But we had, and the earth was without form and void. It was not forming anything, and it was empty of anything. And darkness, that is, it had not yet been energized. Darkness was upon the face of the deep. That was not H2O deep, because H2O did not exist. So we talked about that previously. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And we talked about that idea that there have been some who said, and some translations say, well, the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters. Well, the translation hovered is absolutely wrong, unequivocally wrong. I don't care who says. I don't like the translation moved either, because it does not express the details of the Hebrew text as we saw it. And we pointed out that this word is actually a Hebrew participle that refers to something going back and forth. And when you think of something going back and forth, that is the verb here that's translated move, and it is the verb rachat in Hebrew. And when you think about that, it is also in this place what is called a piel participle, and that piel indicates intensive action, not just going back and forth, or just like a bird's wings would just go back and forth, something like that. But it would be an intensive back and forth motion, which we would nowadays call vibration, something like that. And so the Spirit of God is not just there vibrating upon the face of the water. He's imparting vibration. He's imparting intensive back and forth motion to all the particles that he has brought into existence. And so we saw that idea, and we can go more into it in a little bit perhaps, but still, that is the basic concept. So now you think about, in the first verse, it says basically that God brought into existence. And that's the meaning of created. Created does not mean ex nihilo and all that stuff. We've been through all of that before. But he was bringing into existence something which had no prior existence. And that which he brought into existence was what we call, in the English version, we call it the heaven. It's really dimensionality. It was like God first brought into existence a place for everything to exist. He didn't just make stuff without a place for it to be, if you will. And that is such a shallow way of saying it, but nonetheless, you know, how does a human being, a finite human being, describe the initial creative act of a transcendent, infinite creator? We cannot devise the words. We have to take him at his word, what he said. So the basic idea that what he brought into existence, the heaven, some people say it's the word space, but a lot of people, when you say space, they think outer space. That's not what it means. What it means is basically space is dimensionality. It's a location, if you will, in space. So he brought into existence space, dimensionality, and he brought into existence not the earth, as we saw. Very next verse says the earth was without form, void, darkness, etc. And so therefore it could not refer to anything that has been formed that humans know of that we refer to as earth, including our planet. So the earth would be the basic matter, the basic particles of matter that compose everything that exists, or should say comprise. I like comprise better. So that's the nature of what he did. He brought it all into existence, and so the first verse says he brought it into existence. The second verse tells the state in which it existed, and then the third verse tells the next step in his creative activity with respect to this heaven and earth that he has brought into existence. So as we go on down then, and we see God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light that it was good. And this is one of those places where we have a translation that misleads people because they don't look any farther than just reading what it means in English to them. And sometimes if you just read it in English and you don't understand what went into those English words, you can reach very, very erroneous conclusions. And that a lot of these are that way. But you think about it, sounds like God saw the light, that it was good. It's the idea that comes to the mind of many people is that God brought light into existence. He's brought into existence the earth and space, dimensionality, if you will, and then he brings into existence light. And then God looks at light and God sees, and he actually does a form of evaluation. So he looks at light and then he says, "Oh, that's good." And we have actually heard preachers say things, you know, well, how did that man say it that one time? Well, that came out good. Trying to refer to what God had done when God says that it was good. Wasn't that what it was?
I did good.
So, oh yeah, God looked at it and says, "I did good." You know, do you hear the humanistic perspective of the preacher who puts on the transcendent creator this idea that the transcendent creator says, "Well, oh, look what I did. I did good." That's humanism, folks. That is not of God. And yet, that's what we're dealing with in this modern era. It is humanistic. And what we need to do, we're going to see when we go down a little farther, we're going to look at a descriptive literal translation, and you can see this was not an evaluation by God, because God could do no less than good. When you know God accurately, you don't have God looking at something and evaluating whether or not it's good. God is the very one who is established good. It is established by his person and nothing but his person, and that which represents him accurately is good. Everything else is not good. And there was nothing here to interfere with what he had done. So, And then we have, and God divided the light from the darkness. And I can tell you, people don't have a clue what that means in about 99% of cases. And so then we have God called the light day. Oh, okay, now we can see. He called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Okay, now we've got the evening and the morning were the first day. So we read those things and we think about this and we say, wow, okay, that's good. Let's go down and let's look at these same things in a descriptive, literal translation of that Hebrew text. And here we have that descriptive, literal translation. And you can see I put in, and I used color coding, that light violet for dimensional space, that be space or dimensionality. Green is for basic matter, particles, anything related to basic matter. The blue, the light blue, is for a condition where it has not yet been energized. And then the yellow would be light. We can't imagine I would use yellow for light, would you? And then we have the next one, the gray, is also for the unenergized state of things after verse 3, after God brings electromagnetic energy into existence. So now, what we had then is, in the beginning, and my literal translation, descriptive literal, God brought into existence, that's to create. He brought into existence and they're definite terms. It's not just a or just dimensional space. He brought into existence the dimensional space, or I like the term dimensionality, and the basic matter particles. So he brought these particles into existence from which he's going to form everything. Nowadays, we call them, those of us who have been associated with physics, we call them quantum particles, because they would be the smallest particles of matter that cannot be further subdivided. They cannot be broken apart in any way. So, and we've talked about those before. We're not going into that again. And then, and the basic matter particles, same term, the same term used to end verse 1 is the first term of verse 2, the basic matter particles. Then the verb is existed. It's not our typical idea of was, were, am, is, being, and so forth. It's the verb hayah in Hebrew carries that concept of existence, that something actually existed. And you can say, well, that's equivalent to our am, is, are, was, were, our being verb in English. No, it's not. It's very close, but we have invested our being verb with, shall we say, a lot of lost meaning. And we even call it, many English teachers will call the verb hayah, or the verb to be, just a linking verb. That's all it does. It's just linking two words together. And you'll hear that kind of thing from some who teach other languages. They say, well, there's a linking verb, because the being verbs, these verbs of existence, are very, very often left out in languages other than English. They are left out sometimes in English, but they're very, very often left out in other languages around the world because they're perfectly understood. So the basic matter particles existed. They were unformed into any order, and they were unfilled with anything. But also, next step, and an unenergized condition. So this is before these particles have come into existence to form anything or to be agglomerated with any two of them together. And there was an unenergized condition. That would be the darkness. And it's not visible darkness, because we're not talking about something visible. Keep in mind, electromagnetic energy, light, will not have been created until the next verse in this progression. So this does not refer to darkness the way we think of it, but it refers to the lack of electromagnetic energy. And if there's no electromagnetic energy, it's not there. Whatever was there, those particles are unenergized. And so an unenergized condition existed upon all the faces. And these particles, every one of these particles has multiple faces, that is, sides at which you could look at it. even though they're infinitesimally small, they could be seen from any number of sides, and each one of those sides would be a face. But then in the very next verse, the next line of this verse, the third line of verse 2, the Spirit of God, and here's where we get that He existed, imparting vibration, that intensive back and forth motion upon the faces of the fluid basic matter particles. Because if they had no energy, if they had no electromagnetic, if they had no kinetic energy of any kind, no potential energy, then that cloud of basic matter particles would have been what we would call the perfect fluid. It could flow and they could move, and there would be no resistance to movement. There would be no friction. There would be no attraction. There would be no repulsion. And listen, folks, listen. And this doesn't come from modern physics, but I know enough about modern physics to know this as well. This is exactly the state that the modern physicists assume to have existed immediately after what they call the Big Bang occurred. In an extremely small instant of time after the Big Bang occurred, they say that all the matter in the universe, the entirety of the matter in the universe, existed as the perfect fluid. All the particles existed as perfect fluid. They hadn't come together to form anything. Now, I've got a question for you. How did they figure that out from something that they can't get back to because they can't arrive at those basic matter particles? How'd they figure it out? I submit to you, they went to the Bible, they read what the Bible said, they understood what the Bible said, and then from that, they reached scientific conclusions that are accurate. But at the same time, when they reached those scientific conclusions that are accurate, they would not give the credit to God. They give the credit to themselves. This is standard procedure for modern man. Has been since Adam, I think. So anyway, so in the third verse, then we have God said electromagnetic energy will exist. And then the scripture says electromagnetic energy existed. God said, light be. Remember we said this last week. God said, light be, and light be. What was light going to do? If the creator of all that exists says be, you're going to be. That's what it's going to do. So that's exactly what happened. The creator spoke electromagnetic energy into existence. And now we have all the plus minuses and all these other things. And we have all the characteristics of the electrons and the protons and neutrons and gluons and muons and quarks and everything else that form everything that exists. So now, when we get to verse 4, we have then God provided the electromagnetic energy. And we talked about this a little bit last week, as I recall. The idea that when you look at this, and we say, well, then saw the electromagnetic energy in our English text. But when did God see the electromagnetic energy? Consider this for a second. If God is going to bring into existence electromagnetic energy, he's going to bring light into existence, did he just see it after he brought it into existence? Or did he see it in himself, in his own mind, if you will, if you could say that? Did he not see it before he brought it into existence? As the creator, he was not dependent upon waiting to see what it's going to look like. He had already designed it. It's already designed. It's formed. It's going to be, it's there in his mind. And when he speaks that mind that this will exist, then it comes into what we would call a physical, a dimensional existence as far as humans are concerned, as far as the other things of creation are concerned. But it pre-existed in the mind of God in perfection. Now consider, if it pre-existed in the mind of God, and then he creates it, he brings it into what we'll call physical existence, then how good would it have been when he has brought it into existence? It would have to have been just as good in its existence after its creation as it was in its existence in his mind before creation. Thus, electromagnetic energy, the light, as we call it, would have existed good. And when you think about this verse is not saying that God committed some kind of an evaluation of light and said, oh, I did good. You know, I can tell you, somebody that preaches that kind of stuff, they need to, you need to tell them they need to go sit down. They need to get out of the pulpits and the teaching places, because all they're doing, they're demonstrating that they do not understand the person of God, nor his relationship to his word, nor his relationship to the entirety of creation. But that's where we are, folks. People make up things. Kind of reminds me of 1 Timothy 1 there. So, tempted to go there. You think, I know some of you think, you're awful hard-nosed, Brother Sheets. You're judgmental. No, I'm not being judgmental. I'm just being factual about these things. We have people that say, well, they're good men on all sides. Oh, good men believe this and good men believe that. Well, if they don't believe accurately, they're not good men. If they believe wrongly about God, they are not good in that part of their belief that is wrong. They may have other aspects of belief that are right if they're not too badly influenced by what they believe that's wrong. But it's very common for beliefs, wrong beliefs, tend to spread like the tentacles of an octopus into everything about life and everything that a man should know. And this is why, and I've had people say, you've got to, and I've heard preachers say that you need to use the old Schofield Reference Bible, and when you use that Schofield Bible, that is the original Word of God, and all this, and they go on and on and on, and what they do is they wax more ignorant with everything they spout. No, I said that wrong, didn't I? They do become. They are indicating their ignorance when they say that kind of thing. That is not true. Because, yes, ma'am.
We have someone who's wanting to ask a question.
Yes, who was that? Who wanted to ask a question?
Brother Donaldson is wanting to know if he may ask a question about the statement of light as good.
Well, wait a minute.
All right.
You just told me.
So, Russ.
He says thank you.
So, Russ, you got to hold your horses. So, anyway, by the way, Russ, there's some fella in here that you might know too. His name is Stephen McDonald. So, do you remember him? I know you do. I know you both remember each other. So, anyway, okay. So now we look at this, and I can't show you exactly in the Hebrew text, but you can see the word that I've translated here, because, and then there's an understood verb, and the understood verb, as we've said, is a verb of existence, and the subject is not stated, but the word good is it's an adjective. It is a predicate adjective in this article. So this because it existed good, that is the ground of reason. That's the basis for what God did in the first line. See, this is where grammar becomes important, because when you look at God provided the electromagnetic energy, and you look at that, the very next word is because. That says the because is telling you why God provided the electromagnetic energy, or that God saw the electromagnetic energy. And indeed, when you think about it, we talked about this a little bit last week, I believe, the relationship between seeing and providing. We even use that terminology now. And there are a number of probably at least 5 verses, including Genesis 22:8, I think it is. Isn't that the first one? Where Abraham and Isaac were going up on the mountain, and Isaac asked Abraham, Dad, where's the set? Where's the thing that's going to be offered as a sacrifice? And Abraham said to Isaac, my son, God will provide, not an object, but God will provide himself as an object. It's literally God will provide for himself, and he will provide for himself. And the word that's translated provide is the exact same word that is translated saw in Genesis 1 verse 4. And there are multiple other places where that word that is translated, that we would think basic meaning saw, is translated by this idea of provide. There are about 5 of them that I know of, and we could go through them individually. They're in a separate document, but you can see that idea, and this is the origin of our idea of someone when they receive an instruction, and the instruction is for them to provide for something to be done, whatever that thing is to be done. And the person would say, you see to it. You see to it. That connection between seeing that provision exist and actually causing the provision to exist are closely related. It's tied together. That's why it's the same verb in some places. And it's related. So if you see it, then you provide it. It did not exist until you provided it, but when you provided it, you saw it. Keep in mind another thing. Before you provided it, you had to see it existing in your mind. So when God says, when God saw the electromagnetic energy, what did we say? It wasn't just seen by him physically after it had come into a created existence. It was seen in his mind, and then he provided it in the physical creation. And why did he provide it? The reason why is expressed by that because. It's a causal clause, and it's introduced by a Hebrew word, key. And I can show you, I think, very quickly. Let me go up here, and I'll show you the word. Here's the Hebrew, and the first word is the kaf, or the here yod, and then the second word is the word that we all know. It's the word good, tov. And literally, this clause is a 2-word clause. It's ki tov, because the verb of existence is understood. So it's ki. Ki introduces a causal clause, which is subordinate to the main clause. The main clause is, then God saw the light. That's the main clause. Why did God saw the light? He saw the light because it existed good. And when you think about it, it existed. He saw the light. It's a part of his design. And that design is perfect in every aspect. It is good. And that's what he was saying here. So it's not an evaluative statement. It's a statement as to why God gave this. And consider again, this tells you something about the person of God from the 3rd verse of all scripture that you should be looking at and the way you should see him in everything that he's revealed himself since that 3rd verse written by Adam. And that's that you should see that everything that God does is perfect. It is right. It is good. It's done in love. And you say, what about sending people to the lake of fire and all of that? That's their choice. They have chosen to reject the design of God for reconciliation. So he built the design, he built the system, he has revealed the system, he revealed himself, and then he made the way of an erring creation to be reconciled to him in completeness, total completeness. And then men look at that means of reconciliation and they say, no, I'm not accepting that. I don't believe that. And when we talk about belief is a causing firmness. So until a person calls his firmness to what God has said and done, that person cannot be reconciled. And part in the Old Testament era, up to the time of Christ, everything looked forward to the time when the Son of God would die and pay that debt for all sin of all time. They all looked forward to that time. Did they see it all clearly like we can see it, having the New Testament and everything? No. But they knew that the issue was believing God. Believing God. And that's what Abraham did. Abraham believed in the Lord, and the Lord, counted it to him. He literally Hebrew, he thought for him righteous. That's where righteousness comes, from believing God. And if you think for a half a second, you ought to realize that the God whom Abraham caused firmness to was Father and Spirit and Son. Because the Word and the God that Abraham knew was no less the Son than he was Father or Spirit. The Son was still present, and that was his word, his revelation too. So when you think about this, that's the issue that was happening here. God saw the light, that is, he provided it because it was good, just like everything else that he does. It's what we have done as a result. And we have brought a lot of problems into our own lives and our own societies. And then the next part of that, verse 4 says, then God caused this, it says, then God separated the light between the light and the darkness. And we think, what in the world does that mean? How do you separate light from darkness? Well, consider this. What God had brought into existence. Darkness, as we think of the unenergized state in a sense, darkness, the way we think of it, did not exist until after electromagnetic energy, light comes into existence. When God brings it into existence, and he brings it into existence because it's good. And then God makes a distinction. So, and boy, there's a whole lot of this. This makes me go back, Stephen, to physics and chemistry and all of the atomic particles and subatomic particles and all that, because I'm thinking of every time a particle moves. By the way, just to let you know, there are some physicists in the modern era, and I've read this and I can't tell you where I read it, but there's some physicists in the modern era that think that when one electron moves, every other electron in the universe moves with it. So they're all moving in perfect concert. There's no action and then reaction, that they're all moving in perfect concert with one another. That it's hard to imagine, but not so hard to imagine when you think of a transcendent creator in whom it all exists. So don't ask me to explain that. I don't think I can explain that one any better. But anyway, it's interesting to think about. But so there had to be some distinction between an electromagnetic energy that just whoop, God brings it into existence, and then he's going to create a distinction where there's going to be an electromagnetic energy state, and if there's going to be electromagnetic energy state, then there's also going to be a state that is non-electromagnetic energy, where it is unenergized. and thus that state will be characterized by darkness. What we talk about, when the lights are on, there's energy coming into all the particles in the room. When the lights go off, there's less energy coming in. They slow down. You say, well, it didn't get dark. Relative to those particles, it got dark. That's the way they saw it, because they all slowed down. There was less energy. But then notice, what does he do? He called to, and this is a literal translation, then God called to, and what we would say, the light, that visible electromagnetic energy state. And he called to it, and he says, Yom, day. And to the visibly unenergized state, he called Lila, night. And we talked about that already. And then there was a transition from day, that is the light part of the day, to the dark part of the day. And that transition we call evening. So the Hebrew text says literally, then evening existed. That is a transition from light to dark. The very next statement is, then morning existed. Well, what is morning? Morning is a transition from dark to light, from night to day. And then God gives us that summary statement, day one, Yom Echad, Yom Echad. Now, keeping this all in mind and thinking about that, let's go down a little bit further and I want to go down to verses. And you see, I've got some other materials here, and most people wouldn't want to go through the grammatical analysis of where I laid out the actual grammatical function of each word. But that's something that's something someone like, I don't know, myself would do, probably Rebecca. So anyway, so look at verses 6 through 8. So this is an interesting passage, of course. And God said, let there be a firmament. And so we got an idea what a firmament is. Well, what's a firmament? In the midst of the waters. So there's H2O existing now by the end of verse 5. H2O exists, and there are waters now, because God has brought all the particles together to form all the things that are there, and he's divided light from darkness, and that involves, I have no doubt it also involves the plus and minus charges, et cetera, things like that that are in atoms and so forth, but that's another issue. And so he says, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. So let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters. So somehow we've come to this point. We have apparently our terrestrial ball, our Earth, as we would say, it has come into some kind of shape where it's now, and there's a layer of water. We're going to look at this in a little more visual layout in a moment. But it's like there's something. And then he says, and let it divide. So this firmament is going to divide waters from waters. Divide the waters from the waters. Well, anyway, for the moment, I'm going to act like I don't know what that means. But it seems like it could be easily misunderstood. It has been. It has been. So verse 7, and God made the firmament. Listen, this is not a separate statement. This is related. He said, let there be a firmament. Literally, he's saying a firmament will exist. And then verse 7 says, and he made the firmament. He said he was going to do it, and he did it. That's what it says. Then the second line of verse 6 says, and let it divide. So he says, it will divide the water from the water. Second line of verse 7 says, and God divided the waters. So he said he would do it, and he did it. This is what he said, that's what he did. And then he gives a little more description that he divided the waters. Notice this description. The waters which were under the firmament. So there are going to be waters under this firmament, whatever this firmament is, from the waters which were above the firmament. So that gives you the idea that whatever this firmament is, that there's water below it, then there's a firmament, and then there are waters above it as well, as though it goes between the waters. And then the next line says that it was so. And then God named them. Did you notice how often God names things? Doesn't it tell you something about God? That he chooses to distinguish things in very specific ways by naming them? By the way, Rebecca, if God made specific names for these things, if Adam didn't know the language, and if Adam didn't know any of those names, what good would it have been? Wouldn't have done anything. So that tells us that Adam must have known that language that God's going to use to name these very things. If Adam knew that language, was it just oral? No, it would have been a complete linguistic ability to formulate words and everything. So it would have included an alphabet, how to build words, everything about it, because it came from the Creator who does it all perfectly and leaves nothing for man to figure out to say, well, let me see if I can do this. We have devolved, we have not evolved. We think we've evolved into something great, and we've devolved into something terrible.
It's what we're seeing here, God assigning names in the Hebrew language to these things. I'm convinced that is why when the angel comes to Daniel there in the book of Daniel, we switch from Aramaic back to Hebrew.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Because that would have been the language of the angel. Mm-hmm. So the angel speaks Hebrew, and Daniel speaks Hebrew and Aramaic. Mm-hmm. So he just switches back to Hebrew because that's the language. Sure. Okay. Very good. So then God named it, and he called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. And that's the same construction we saw before. Let's go down to the descriptive literal translation down here a little bit. Now, what I have done with this thing, this word firmament, the word firmament is actually a word in Hebrew. It's the word rakia. Rakia. Interesting, it is one of those ai verbs. So it's that rakia, and it kind of refers to the idea that something has been spread out, stretched thin, and cover something. You know what? And I've got this. Hold on a minute. I have to stop and think.
As I recall, it's what they used, the same word that they used to refer to an overlay.
Yes, of gold, like when they were making idols.
Yeah.
They would, because gold is so malleable, they use essentially pure gold, and they could beat it out to a very, 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 very thin sheet, and then they could overlay it on a wooden idol form and beat it into place around the form. By the way, that same process is still used in the present day in a lot of places, and it can still be done. And then that made this wooden idol look like it was made of gold. But I was going to say I had something else. I had something else on rakia that I meant to bring up and I forgot about opening it up today. So I may touch on it next week. But so basically what a rakia is a thin, stretched out layer of something. And you say, well, what would that have been? What would the rakia have been? The rakia would have thus been what we call, it would be between the waters below and the waters above. It sounds like it'd be called the atmosphere, our atmosphere around our earth. But you say, well, why would it be called a thin, stretched out layer. Listen, look at what God says. God said, and so I'm going to use this term, a thin, stretched out layer. I'm going to use that to translate rakia. So that's the word God used, rakia. So a thin, stretched out layer will exist in the midst of the waters. Sounds like God says this is what's going to happen, and it will exist, causing a separation between waters to waters. So it's going to be a separation between waters. Now notice, God said he was going to do it. Guess what the next verse says? Verse 7 says, then he did it. Then God made the thin, stretched out layer. Now look what he did with that thin, stretched out layer. This is significant. Then he caused separation between the waters, and literally, which existed from, notice, 3 prepositions in a row. From, under, to. So from under to the thin, stretched out layer. So you've got this idea, there's something that was under, so under this rakia, there were waters that existed under it, and they were from under, someplace under, and they were under to the rakia. So that says there was this some kind of layer of water under this rakia. He uses the exact same terminology, and he says, and between the waters which existed, and now look at what he does here, from above to the rakia. So there's whatever this rakia is, there's going to be water that is from under it to the rakia, and there's water that's going to be from above it to the rakia. But the rakia is going to be the dividing thing between the waters and the waters. Then the scripture says, then it existed in this manner. That's what God did. And then we come down. Then God called to this thin, stretched out layer, and I use the term, it is the Hebrew term shamayim, just like what he made in the beginning. God created the heaven and the earth. Bereshit bara Elohim es, here's the word, shamayim, the heaven and what and the earth. So shamayim. So what God called to this thin, stretched out layer, he's been calling it a rakia, a thin, stretched out something between the waters. And now he calls it by a name, shamayim. And so what is it? The shamayim he had originally brought into existence was space, dimensionality. And now he calls this space. You say, oh, well, space is out there in outer space. We're not talking about the idiocy of modern men. We're talking about what God brought into existence in the very aboriginal existence of everything. So we're not talking about your idea, what you see now, 6,000 years later. We're talking about that from God's perspective, what he did. He put a dimensionality between the waters. And then the scripture says, then there was that transition from light to dark again, evening, a transition from dark to light, morning. And then he said that day exists a second day. So this is the second day. Now, let's go over here a minute, because we are very often look at something and we'll think, well, how could you think of the atmosphere as a thin, stretched out layer? Even right now, when we go up, we can go up, planes fly 35,000, some up to 40,000 feet, 7 to 8 miles up in the air. And so they can get up there and they're still flying around above the earth. And we can do all these other things that we could send up. I think, as I recall, the Virgin Galactic that sends their little thing up and takes people for rides up to the edge of space and all. I think they've been up to somewhere in the range of 50 miles, maybe more. And they're looking at trying to go up to 80 miles above the earth. And you think, wow, boy, that's really high. Oh, yeah? Is it? Let's look at this for a minute. Let's think about the thickness of the atmosphere. We'll do a little slideshow here. Go from the beginning. So the earth, the thickness of its atmosphere. And what is the atmosphere? It's this nice little layer of something around the earth. Now, I could have put a little round ball there and called it the earth, but I chose not to do that. So the thickness of its atmosphere. Now consider, remember we talked about that thin layer of gold overlay on something. Like a thin layer of gold overlay on a precious object. Not what man did, but what the Creator did. The Creator God provided the atmosphere of earth to enclose the planet He had created specifically for human life. So this is a work of the Creator, and that means it is very good. Very good. Can't be better. But this is a little picture that NASA puts out about the atmosphere, and they give you the thickness of all of these things. Here's the troposphere down here. It looks like the orange color. Then there's the stratosphere above, and then there's the mesosphere, and then there's the thermosphere, and then there's the exosphere, which basically the exosphere is what we call outer space. And they say this they got that on the side. They got up to like 400 kilometers. 400 kilometers would be about 250 miles above. If you look at what they have here, they show satellites. This is about how high most satellites are. It depends on the size of the satellite, speed of the satellite, everything like that, because gravity is what keeps it from flying out into outer space, and it's got to be overcome to get away from the Earth. Then they show sounding rockets down here, and they're about, and by the way, if you want to figure out how many miles high that is, 400 kilometers is about 250 miles. So it's not very far up off the surface of the Earth, you're going to see. This is around about 150 kilometers, let's say about 100 miles up or so. That's where the aurora borealis and all of the, what do we call them? I forgot the northern lights and all of that thing, where they show up and so forth. Then you've got air glow and things like that. You got clouds down here. But the interesting thing is, look down here. Do you see this at the bottom? There's a mountain. When you consider the troposphere, which is basically the part of the atmosphere in which we can live because we got air, it only goes from about maybe 9 miles up, which would be, we'll say round numbers, 45,000 feet, 9 miles, up to about 15 miles, which is about 75,000 feet. Actually, a little more than that, but that's okay. So it goes from about maybe 50 up to about 50 to 80,000 feet. That's the troposphere. But how high are the mountains there? Look at the mountains are in the troposphere. These high mountains that we think are so tall. Well, let's go a little farther. Note the size of the tallest mountain compared to the thickness of the troposphere. It doesn't go that high. Now the Earth's 8,000 miles in diameter, and thus has a radius from its center up to the surface of about 4,000 miles. A little bit less, but not very much. Very, very close. The deepest point in Earth's surface is the Marianas Trench at just over 36,000 feet, which is less than 7 miles. Listen, we're talking about a planet that has a radius of 4,000 miles, and the Marianas Trench, the deepest crack in the Earth's surface, is less than 7 miles. That ought to begin to put something together in your mind. The highest point on Earth's surface is Mount Everest. It's just over 29,000 feet, or less than 6 miles. So the deepest trench is less than 7 miles. The highest mountain is less than 6 miles. So what? I thought you'd never ask. Thus, the Marianas Trench is like a scratch in the surface of the 4,000 mile radius of the Earth. Did you catch that? I said a scratch in the surface. Comparing, put 7 miles divided by 4,000 miles, that is a fraction of 0.00175. That 0.001, that would be in the realm of thousands. So this is 1.75 thousandths. That's the ratio. That scratch is less than 2,000 thousandths, it should say there. Somebody left the TH out. Deep in that radius. Now, what about Mount Everest being high? Mount Everest is like a bump on the surface of the 4,000-mile radius of the Earth. Comparing 6 miles out of 4,000 is the fraction 0.0015. That is a bump that is even less than the height than the Marianas are trenches deep. Less than 2 thousandths higher than the surface of the radius of the Earth. So what does this mean? If the Earth were the size of a cue ball is specified by the American Billiards Association or whatever it is like that, some of those groups. It's specified it must be 2.25, or one of these balls in when you play billiards, 2.25 inches, and it cannot vary more than plus or minus 0.005 inches. It can't vary more than 5/1000ths of an inch. And if you wanted to take it as radius, like we did with the 4,000-mile radius of the Earth, that would be 1.125 inches in radius, and it couldn't vary more than 0.0025 inches. That's pretty close. The roundness of a cue ball would be required to be within the fraction of, look at this number, 0.0022, 2.2 thousandths of an inch, or in a fraction of 2.2 thousandths. But the depth of the Marianas would only be 1.75 thousandths. That'd be less than the range of acceptability of this cue ball. And it would be, that's more than the difference for the Marianas Trench or Mount Everest on the surface of our 4,000-mile radius Earth. Listen, what does that mean? You've heard this, you may have heard this expressed before. It's a simple fact. The Earth then, with all its bumps and all its scratches, would be about the same smoothness as a used cue ball. And I can tell you, having shot some pool and things like that in years past, that I haven't done it in a long time, but it was fun to do. But I can tell you, I looked at the cue ball and I thought, wow, man, that thing is perfect. I mean, and it's just as smooth and everything. But it had just tiny, tiny, tiny imperfections or scratches, maybe where it hit the floor or something like that. And those tiny, tiny imperfections, that would have been the imperfections that would have been the size of Mount Everest on the Earth, or the depth of the Marianas Trench on the Earth. That's the nature of those imperfections and little scratches and marks and things that would have been on there. That's the nature of this Earth on which we live. So now think about that. That's a picture taken from the space station of the Earth. That's a curvature of the Earth. Notice the curvature of the Earth. It doesn't look very round. You can see it's curving, but it doesn't look very round. But you know what it is? That's sunrise. And as they point out, you consider how large a diameter this circle would be. That is the circle of the Earth, and that little blue haze that's above there, that is the thickness of the atmosphere. I think you could say that the atmosphere is a thin, stretched out layer over the surface of the earth. And that is what God put into between the waters. He put a thin, stretched out layer of dimensionality, and I call it the rakia, but a better word probably our atmosphere. He put an atmosphere between the waters, and let's look at the rest of it. But you think about that. That gives you an idea of how thick our atmosphere is, with the sun shining through it to this camera that's on the space station, 200 miles up or so. I forgot what the exact height was. But let this represent the Earth. That looks like our Earth, and it's got this molten core down here. And so it's 8,000 miles in diameter, but it has a radius from the center out to the surface of about 4,000 miles. So now when we go on, now I've enlarged it a little bit. So what does God do? When he was building the planet Earth, the Creator combined the basic quantum particles of matter, to form all the different types of atoms and molecules, which comprise all the matter, what we call eretz, that's his word, eretz, that exists. And then he uses this matter to form the solid material of the planet. So now we have a planet. Now, then he puts on this planet, he's building the water layer on Earth. The Creator combined the hydrogen, H, and the oxygen, O, atoms, he had formed to create H2O molecules, binding these molecules together to form the liquid state of matter called water, maya. And he covers the entire surface of the Earth with this water to a depth of about 2 miles. There have been many calculations regarding how much water is on Earth. And if all the water on Earth were spread evenly over the surface of the Earth, and the surface was essentially smooth, as I recall the number, it would be about 8,700 feet deep, which is less than 2 miles. But that'd be 2 miles of water on top of all the surface of the Earth. So, thus, compared to the size of the Earth, the water depth compared to the radius of the Earth was only 2/4,000, 1/2000, or look at that, 1/2 of a thousandth. That's the ratio that would be. It'd be a very, very thin layer. If the Earth radius were 2 inches, then the water layer would be less than 1/1000th of an inch thick. Think about that 2-inch cue ball. Now, what did he do? What do these verses say? These verses say that he put a rakia in the midst of the waters. So building the atmosphere around the Earth, the Creator combined his nitrogen, N, which is about 78% of the atmosphere, and oxygen, which is about 21-ish or so, and then the rest of it, the other 1% is mainly argon and some of the other materials there, some other atoms. But so he does this to create the 2 main components of air, the gaseous form of matter. So he built liquid form of matter, H2O, water, and then he builds a gaseous form of matter, and we call it air. And this comprises Earth's atmosphere. He then inserted a thin layer of this air called a firmament, a rakia, about 20 to 50 miles thick, into the water layer, thus creating 2 layers. So there are 2 water layers now, one from above to the rakia and one from below to the rakia. So here we are now. We've got this layer of the atmosphere, and I indicated it by the yellow, in between 2 layers of water. And you say, well, one layer is thicker than the other. Well, that's because I'm not a very good artist, shall we say. God did a better job. So you got in the midst, you got the atmosphere, you got the earth, the dirt, if you will, and then you got the atmosphere of the earth, about 20 miles thick. 20 miles goes up to 100,000 feet. Not many vehicles go up above 100,000 feet. There's very, very few. And that's why people pay lots of money to go up in that Virgin Galactic, to just go up and say, I'm like an astronaut. Well, I guess that's all right. And then you have the waters from under to the Rakia, and then you also have the waters from above to the Rakia. And so when you think about this, this is the whole system that was built. Here's a little bit different look at it. There would have been solid matter dirt underneath. There's going to be outer space, that's this dark gray up here at the top, that's going to be above. But in there, there's going to be a layer of water below, from below to the Rakia. And then there's going to be a layer of water from above to the Rakia. And in the middle, we have this firmament, our atmosphere, about 20 miles thick. And you think about it, you can take these things and you can just work right down from verse 1, step by step by step, as to how God brought all of this into existence. And you think about it, he puts the waters there. Wait, what happened to these waters? Interesting thought. What happened? If he put the waters there, then what made the waters go away? We'll say go away. Well, they didn't go away. They're still here. They're just in our oceans, lakes, and rivers, and everything else. And still quite a bit of it in the atmosphere. But let me go over to one more thing before we stop here. Just a quick point here before we close up today. But verse 9. So now you think about it. You've got this earth. You've got a layer of water on the earth. You've got an atmosphere above the water that's on the earth, and then you got water that's above the atmosphere. There is no land. There is no dry land. The whole surface of the earth is covered with water, and water on the earth, then water that's above the rakia, that's above the atmosphere. There is no dry land, as we call it. But look what God did in verse 9. And God said, let the waters under the heaven, what was it he said he had just created? I think he called to the rakia and he called to it Shemayim. Well, let's just check. Is that really the word that he used here? I can find some Hebrew text here. Could be some Hebrew text down here. So, whoop. I got a little bit off on this layout here, but anyway. Okay, so let's go. We'll go now that we got it laid out where we want. I'm going to compare these. So, and God said, the waters under the heaven will be gathered together into one place. Let's go down now to where we were. And so, oops, I forgot, I meant to say, and the waters under the heaven. So we're looking for that word, heaven. And when we come down here, so here is Vayomer Elohim. Then God said, Yikawu Amayim Mitachat. Oh, look at this. Ha Shamayim. There's that word. That's that same word. That's what he had just named the Rakia. He named the Rakia. So what he's talking about here, he's not talking about heaven That's all of that that's out there in outer space and all of that stuff. He's talking about the Rakia. He named the Rakia and he called it Shemayim. And here in verse 9, then he says, the waters that are under the Shemayim, under the Rakia. The waters that were above the Rakia, they stayed there. But the waters that were under the Rakia, under the Shemayim, under this heaven, as we say, our atmosphere, he says, they're going to be gathered together. They will be gathered together. El Makom Echad. The word Echad is one. And that's why the waters now they are one. That's why you can go from one sea to the other and just keep going around. They're all connected, if you will. And so that's the idea of what he was doing. Now, let me go down here a little farther. So I want to look at this literal translation for just a minute. We're going to close up today. But this is my literal translation of that. Then God said, the waters from under the heaven will be gathered unto one place. And notice what he says. And the dry, it's not dry land, and the dry will be provided. Literally, it will be seen. So that's the idea. Think about it. There was no dry land until verse 9, when God brings dry into existence. And the scripture says, then it existed in this manner. Consider something. You say, well, he put all the waters in one place, all totally connected. How would he do that? Let me ask you, have you ever heard of I just forgot his name, the AIG guy who does the geography, geology, and all of that? Snelling, Andrew Snelling. Yes, Dr. Andrew Snelling. And I have videos by Andrew Snelling and Dr. John Baumgartner too. And they did some excellent work on what would have happened and how these things occurred. But did you know that the continents actually float on the surface of the mantle? Catch that. The continents float on the surface of the mantle. You say, no, they couldn't float. They're made of rock. There are different densities of rock. There are different densities of all kinds of things. And by the way, the modern iron and steel and aluminum and even gold, that's how you get gold from other things. You heat up this rock that may have gold in it, the rocks will melt and the gold will melt, and the gold is more dense than the liquid rock and it will fall to the bottom. And that happens in steel industry as well. And that's why you get slag coming off the top and so forth, all these things like that. But you see, that's what the continents do. The continents are less dense than is the material comprising the mantle of the earth. And thus the continents float on the mantle. So consider this. It's spoken as gathering the waters into one place. Well, it's water all over already. But what is he doing? He wants the dry to appear. So what he does is he causes various areas of this mantle material, if you will, to come together in such a way that they solidify and they float on the rest of the mantle. And so they float, and as they rise up in floating above the mantle, the waters run off of them. This is, well, let's go down and let's see here. This is day 3 of creation. So we're not talking about there being, oh, all these gazillions of little creatures are going to be petrified and they're going to become limestone, this and that. This is not the issue happening now. This is the second day has just occurred. Now we're on the third day of creation. And he causes continents to rise. And when the continents rise, the water just moves back into its place. It's still all totally connected. But now we have areas of dry, yavasha. That's what the word is in Hebrew, yavasha. And so we have yavasha, dry. And now we have, think about what that means. Now the earth will have continents, it will have dry material, and it will have all these areas of water around the dry material. But where is the water that was from above to the Rakia? It's still there. Listen, one last thing. There are people in biblical creation science that have said, you could not have a layer of liquid water up there in the atmosphere. You couldn't do that. It would evaporate. It would all be lost out into space and you couldn't have it. You know, the people who are saying that kind of stuff aren't reading the scriptures and believing the scriptures. Because if God could bring an earth into existence, if he could bring into existence dimensionality and all of the entire electromagnetic spectrum, and he could order it and bring it together so that it makes particles and then planets and what we're going to find later, sun and moon and stars and all of that, what would it be for him to put a layer of water around the earth and say, stay there? It would be nothing. It's only the lack of belief of men and the lack of their understanding of what the scriptures actually said in Hebrew that turns their minds off and they say, oh, it couldn't be. I'm sorry. Can be. It was. And that layer of water was there till God brought it down at the time of the flood. And that created havoc with the land masses for sure. So with that, anyway, so any question or anything from anybody before we go? Russ? Russ doesn't have a question. Do you? Vivian, are you all right there?
Yes, sir, I am.
Yeah, I got it.
Brother Donaldson said,
So you have more questions than answers?
funny. He says, I have more questions than answers, and that excites me. Regarding the statement of light is good, is it accurate to view that statement as directly to the author of Genesis and its future readers, as a sort of definition or example to understand what good is, with understanding that the unenergized state of dark is also by necessity good?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Whatever, people say, well, when God said, oh, it's not good that man should be alone. And they say, oh, does that mean that at that stage of the creation it wasn't good? That's called ignorance. But every stage, God built the creation. That's why we have days of creation. He built everything in stages. He didn't just do this silly thing like poof, and there, oh, it's all there perfect in a moment of time. That's not what he did. He brought the matter and the dimensionality into existence. And then he forms them. He makes them into things. And every stage is totally in conformity to the design of God for that stage. And thus, at every stage of creation, good, which is defined by the Creator, good was the state of the creation. And thus, when he created man, and you think about it, when we've talked about this a little bit, why would he create man and then have man alone, name all the animals and be able to see this? And people say, well, Adam would have felt bad because he didn't have a mate or something. But listen, don't say dumb stuff like that. That kind of stuff, it puts wrong kind of emotional responses in the human male before ever anything failed. Everything was perfectly good before the man violated. You say, well, what about woman? Well, she was there. She violated too. But her violation didn't, she was not the head of creation like the male was. And thus, the creation did not fail as in total. But every stage, every point of the creation, how God did it, was perfect. And that perfection is defined by God, and God is the very definition of good. You remember I've said to many of you, and as I've told the Kenyans at different times, I do not say God is good. And people, we've got this, and by the way, I recommend to you, don't even say that stupid statement, God is good. Oh yeah, all the time, God is good. You know that well. And no, it's just, that makes it sound like there's an external standard of good out there to which God has to conform or adhere in some way. That's not true. God is not good. God is the very definition of good. He's the one who has established, and he's the one who designed it. And everything that he has done is perfect. And it is absolutely good because it can accord with his person. And then you would say, as a man said one time, well then where did sin come from? I thought you'd never asked. Come back next week. We might get there. So that's what Heather says to the kids. So I'll say it to you all. So, but anyway, all right. So if nothing else, we're going to close up shop and let everybody go. Russ, good to hear from you. I hope you're still being good for nothing. And Vivian and Matthew and Judy Elaine and Andrew and David and Joe. So if nothing else, we will stop our recording.